Welcome to the Long March Forward for Voting Rights. I'm Margaret with Civic, Nebraska's voting rights team. Today we look at the long and complicated history of Black voter suppression. For our purposes, we'll mark the end of the Civil War as a starting point for our discussion, although prejudice against Black and Indigenous people was written into the U.S. Constitution. After the assassination of President Lincoln, his successor, President Johnson, allowed Southern states to pass restrictive Black codes designed to control the labor and behavior of former slaves and other African Americans. This resulted in a backlash by Congress, which passed the Reconstruction Act in 1867. The act imposed federal military rule over most of the South. This was followed in 1870 by the 15th Amendment. It states, Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on condition of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These protections allowed more than 500,000 Black men to become registered voters during the 1870s. At the same time, in Mississippi, former slaves made up more than half of the state's population, and these new voters sent 2 Black U.S. senators to Washington and elected a number of Black state officials, including a lieutenant governor. Most of this new voting bloc voted solidly Republican. In 1877, Reconstruction ended, and with no federal troops to protect the rights of Black citizens, many Black men ceased voting due to intimidation from employers and threats of violence by the Ku Klux Klan. The next legislative step to repress Black voters occurred in Mississippi in 1890, when officials convened a convention to write a new state constitution. Convention leader Solomon Calhoun stated, "We came here to exclude the Negro." Because the 15th Amendment explicitly prohibited states from excluding Black men from voting, the Mississippi Constitution worked around the amendment to place barriers to prevent them from voting. These included an annual poll tax, which voters were required to have paid for 2 years consecutively in order to vote, a literacy test, where potential voters had to read aloud from the state constitution and then were quizzed by the county clerk, the grandfather clause, which exempted from the aforementioned requirements those whose ancestors were qualified to vote before the Civil War. Other southern states soon did likewise, and the number of Black Americans voting plunged. By 1940, intimidation, violence, and racial discrimination in state voting laws led to only a meager 3% of voting-age Black men and women registered to vote in the South. In Mississippi, less than 1% were registered. By not being able to vote, African Americans had little influence in their communities. They had no say in how their taxes were utilized. They did not hold public office. They had little, if any, control over local police courts or public schools. In the 1950s, ensuring the voting rights of African American men and women became a central focus of the civil rights movement. In 1955 alone, in 2 separate incidents, Reverend George Lee and Lamar Smith, 2 voting rights activists, were killed. Smith was gunned down in broad daylight on the lawn of the county courthouse, and despite numerous eyewitnesses, no one has ever been convicted of his murder. In 1957 and 1960, Congress passed 2 civil rights acts to strengthen the Justice Department's ability to enforce existing voting rights laws. The primary success of the acts was the creation of the Commission on Civil Rights. 1961 saw the coordinated effort by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Council of Federated Organizations to undertake a massive effort to register Black voters in the South. Mississippi was chosen as their first target due to its low percentage of registered Black voters, only 6.7%. Large numbers of students from the North joined the Freedom Riders for several subsequent summers. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, became the next leap forward for voting rights when poll taxes are eliminated in federal elections. Despite this, Dallas County, Alabama is selected as the next target for mass voter registration, as less than 1% of eligible Black citizens are registered to vote. On March 7, 1965, 600 people attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, and were attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge by police and state troopers wielding billy clubs and tear gas. Televised coverage sparked global outrage. President Lyndon Johnson quickly responded by signing the Voting Rights Act. on August 6, 1965, which banned the use of literacy tests and provided for federal oversight of the voting process in areas where less than 50% of the non-white population was not registered. It also authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in state and local elections. Voting rights protections are struck a major blow in 2014 when the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Shelby versus Holder. Their decision eliminates many of protections of the Voting Rights Act when it determines local election officials can change voting laws and close polling locations without approval from the federal government. Since this decision in 2014, more than 1,600 polling locations have closed, mostly in communities that are comprised of people of color. Scholars at UCLA found that voters in black neighborhoods waited, on average, 29% longer to vote than voters in predominantly white communities. Another loss for the advancement of voting rights occurred on July 17, 2020, with the death of voting rights icon, Representative John Lewis. He served as U.S. Representative for Georgia's 5th District for 33 years and was one of 600 people who marched from Selma to Montgomery on Bloody Sunday. With us today is Brad Christian Salas to talk about voter suppression. He is the field director with Civic, Nebraska. Thanks for being here, Brad. Can you tell us, what does voting mean to you?
Voting is all about power in the community and coming together as a community to really shape what your community is going to become, what it looks like, make sure that however elected officials are changing things, they're changing it the way you want it to be changed. That's what voting is all about. It's about being able to influence your community and influence the wider world and make a difference and make things better for others.
So by voting, can we change everything?
Voting can't change everything alone. It's going to take voting, but it's going to take other tools in our toolkit to really make a difference in our democracy. So it takes voting, it takes protesting, it takes going up to the legislature to advocate, it takes reaching out to your House representatives and your senators. It takes all of those different things to really be able to make that difference. And most of all, it takes coming together with others.
So we've talked about the history behind the Voting Rights Act and the contributions of John Lewis.
Representative John Lewis was a perfect example of coming together with others and understanding that voting is such a crucial piece, a fundamental piece to us participating in our democracy, but that it wasn't the only piece. He's somebody who got the right to vote because he took those other steps and really fought for his rights. And that's what we all have to do. We have to all be willing to stand up, get in some good trouble, and fight for our rights, especially the right to vote.
So what can average people do to help ensure that voting rights are secure and will be around in the future?
Average people can do everything. We really need everyone stepping up, doing everything they can. I think a lot of us start thinking that it takes somebody extraordinary to be able to step up and do the things like we saw John Lewis do, but it just takes us being inspired enough and being brave enough and having enough courage to realize the importance of these things and start doing those things. Right now, we're having a lot of battles and fights for voting rights here in Nebraska. And so what we really need people to do is reach out to Civic Nebraska so we can get them involved and get them in that fight so that they can hopefully become the next John Lewis, because not only is it going to take us having a next John Lewis, but it's going to take us having a lot of new John Lewises. There's going to have to be more than one, because this is a huge fight we're in, and we are definitely going to be outspent, but we can't be outworked. So we need everyone to come and step up and get involved.
We see a big turnout every 4 years for the presidential elections and then a huge drop-off in voter participation during the midterms. How do we keep people engaged?
So I think the big thing with keeping people engaged is making sure they really understand that local elections and the smaller elections are the ones that have that bigger difference in your life. When we're looking at things like state level ballot initiatives, those are the things that really make the difference in our everyday lives. As interesting as the presidential elections are, and as much attention is paid to those, they don't compare to the impact that a mayor's race or a city council race will make in your day-to-day life.
So Shelby and Holder sort of opened the doors and made voting rights vulnerable. What's the latest threat?
So there's a lot of different threats to voting rights right now. A lot of these have come since Shelby versus Holder. So you have things like voter ID, which disenfranchises Black, brown, rural, low-income voters and college students. You have things like gerrymandering, where instead of the people being able to pick their representatives are picking who's going to vote for them, which is not the way it should be. We have old threats that have been around since before Shelby versus Holder, like felony disenfranchisement. So there's a lot of different things, and the only way we're really going to be able to stop these things is to make it clear we won't stand for them as citizens and as voters.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Brad.
Oh no, thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
The events surrounding the 2020 election and the attempt to pass restrictive voting rights laws in 48 states has been a sobering reminder of just how in peril our democracy is. Each one of those bills which passes strips away a bit of the legacy of John Lewis and others like him. Nebraskans' right to vote is currently facing our toughest fight yet, with a ballot initiative drive to amend our Constitution to include voter ID for 2022. Visit civicnebraska.org to see how you can oppose this latest threat to democracy, or scan the QR code. You too can join the long march forward for voting rights.